Switching to Mint Mobile is the easiest way to save in 2024. Wireless plans are $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan. To get this new customer offer, go to mintmobile.com/Murrell. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. Today we're going to talk about Matthew Vaughn's latest film Argylle and its failure to take over the box office even though we're in a very slow couple months of the year. We're also going to look at Apple original films and see how much gas they might have left in the tank. We're going to take your questions on the Mint Mobile hotline and look at a lot of other numbers, and let's jump right into it. These were the top 5 films at the box office this past weekend, January 2nd through the 4th. As mentioned, Argylle was number 1. There had been hopes that maybe it could get up to $20 million for its debut weekend, but it came in below even the original estimates. The estimates for the weekend had it at $18 million. The final number is $17,473,540. Easily number 1, yes, but hardly a dominating performance. When we look at it compared to Matthew Vaughn's domestic openings thus far, it is the 5th highest opening film in Vaughn's directorial career domestically. At number 4 is Kick-Ass, which debuted at $19.8 million back in 2010. Then the first Kingsman movie, which debuted at just over $36 million in 2015. A couple years later, Kingsman: The Golden Circle opened to just over $39 million. And then Matthew Vaughn's career high opening is X-Men: First Class back in June of 2011, which had a $55.1 million opening weekend. In second place was The Chosen, Season 4, Episodes 1 through 3. This is the latest from Angel Studios. They've had a lot of success releasing their show, The Chosen, which is also available on other platforms theatrically, and I believe we're going to get some more episodes later on down the line. It debuted to a $5.9 million opening weekend. It opened earlier in the week, so it's made about $7.3 million overall at the box office. The Beekeeper hits the number 3 spot. It drops 20.9% for a $5.28 million weekend total. Its domestic total now just under $50 million. Wonka is still in the top 5 after a couple months of release. It drops just 17.4% from last weekend and a $4.67 million total. Its domestic total is now over $200 million. Rounding out the top 5 is Migration. It continues to hold well. It drops 14.4% for a $4.19 million weekend total. Its domestic total now at just over $106 million. Looking at numbers 6 through 10, Mean Girls actually goes from the number 1 movie in the country to number 6 out of the top 5. It drops 44.4% for a $3.8 million weekend total. Its domestic total now over $66 million. Anyone But You drops 25.4% in its 7th weekend. It's at just over $3.4 million total for the weekend and a $76.2 million domestic total as it rolls into Valentine's Day, where it's putting out a new edition of the movie. And people have asked me about Anyone But You and its legs domestically. I can tell you right now, it's at 12.7 times its opening weekend, which are great legs. You know, when we talk about a big blockbuster movie, those are usually 2.5 to 3 times the opening weekend. To put that in context, the first Avatar movie did about 10 times its opening weekend. It was also a slow burn, although obviously at a much bigger scale. But if you want to compare it to a movie like The Greatest Showman, then Anyone But You isn't quite there yet. The Greatest Showman had about 20 times its opening weekend. The final domestic total was 20 times the opening weekend number. Anyone But You isn't there yet, but it continues to hold very well, and we'll see how it does in this next week and then going into the Valentine's Day midweek box office next week. In 8th place was American Fiction, which continues to expand following its Oscar nominations. It dropped just 7.7% for a $2.397 million weekend total. Its domestic total is now over $15 million. Poor Things is in 9th place with a 25.9% drop off from last weekend at a total just over $2 million. Its domestic gross now over $28.2 million. And Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom hanging around the top 10 for at least one more week. In its 7th week of release, a 27.9% drop. Its weekend total is below $2 million, and its domestic total is now over $120.7 million. Dropping out of the top 10, 2 one-week wonders. One of them is the Indian film Fighter. The other one is Godzilla -1, its second run in the top 10, and it really only dropped off because it was taken out of theaters. It's not that it organically dropped off the top 10 grossing movies. It just had a limited time at the box office. Looking at the movies that lost the most theaters this past weekend, ISS crashing out of theaters. It lost 1,688 theaters. It is now out of wide release, 814 14 theaters remaining, just not a box office event of any type. Then we have 3 films that had some Oscar-related expansions that turned out to be short-lived. The Holdovers loses 708 theaters. It's now in 562. It was a reissue from last fall. Oppenheimer loses 689 theaters. It was another big expansion. It's now in 579 theaters. Killers of the Flower Moon lost 655 theaters. It now remains in 286 of them. And Night Swim lost 568 theaters. It's now in 1,700 theaters. Looking at what I call the box office road to recovery, the red line is the weekend average for 2021 through 2023. The blue line is the pre-pandemic weekend average for 2015 through 2019. And as you can see, we are much closer still to where we've been than where we were before the pandemic. The highest grossing film for the 2021 to 2023 window was the debut of Jackass Forever a couple of years ago. And going back to the pre-pandemic era, the highest grossing film for this weekend was Kung Fu Panda 3 several years ago. Of course, we have Kung Fu Panda 4 on the way in just a few short weeks. 3 films officially closed this week. Thanksgiving after 11 weeks, The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes also after 11 weeks, and Godzilla Minus One after 9 weeks. I should note that Barbie has not shown up on the box office charts for the past couple weeks. I'm holding out just to make sure they don't do some kind of a limited re-release right around Oscar time, but it doesn't look like they're going to do that. So if I don't see anything by next week, then I'll go ahead and do a wrap-up of Barbie because it looks like it has finally ended its theatrical run. But let's look at the 3 movies that did definitely close. Starting first of all with Thanksgiving from Eli Roth. It ends with a domestic gross of just over $31.9 million, an international gross of $14.5 million, and a worldwide gross at around $46.5 million. That's about triple its reported budget, so not a bad run for Thanksgiving. It was in domestic release for 11 weeks, did not spend any weeks at number 1, and has no remaining markets. And when we look at where Thanksgiving lands as far as Eli Roth's highest grossing domestic films, The House with the Clock in Its Walls, such a weird movie to be his highest grossing film, is number 1 at $68.5 million. Also the only Eli Roth film to go over $100 million worldwide. 2006's Hostel is in second place at $47.3 million, followed by 2018's Death Wish at just over $34 million. Then we have Thanksgiving in fourth place at $31.9 million, and 2003's Cabin Fever rounding out the top 5 at just over $21.1 million. Also closing this week was The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes after 11 weeks in domestic release. A domestic gross of $166.35 million, an international gross that's pretty much the same, $170.8 million, for a worldwide gross of $338.1 million off a reported budget of $100 million. It spent 2 weeks at number 1 with 0 remaining markets. And like I said when the movie was out, if you look at what was spent on it, $100 million, to bring back over 3 times that amount at the worldwide box office, that's something that any studio I think is going to be happy about. But when you look at it in context of the Hunger Games franchise itself, when we look domestically, it is well short, over $100 million short of the lowest grossing Hunger Games film, which was 2015's Mockingjay Part 2. And when you look worldwide, it is over $300 million shy of Mockingjay Part 2. So yes, it was a good performance for the size of its budget. It was smart to not overspend on that movie, and I think that they're going to get a return on that. But as far as recapturing the Hunger Games franchise or refanning that flame, if you will, it doesn't look like The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes did that exactly. I don't know if you kicked the door down to start a whole new chapter of the franchise, but also not a disaster like so many other movies have run into this past year. Finally closing this week after 9 weeks of release was Godzilla Minus One. It never spent a weekend at number 1. It doesn't have any remaining markets, but it had a domestic gross of $56.4 million. The domestic gross was actually higher than the entire international gross in other countries in which it was released at $48.9 million. The worldwide gross is $105.4 million off of a reported budget said to be between $10 to $15 million. We don't know quite how much that exactly was. When we look at the live-action international film grosses here domestically, Godzilla Minus One ends just behind Life is Beautiful. If they hadn't pulled the movie out of theaters, I think it probably would have gotten that number 2 spot. It also is the highest-grossing live-action Japanese release here in the United States. There are some anime releases. I know at least one Pokemon movie that comes ahead of it. But as far as live-action Japanese films, the top-grossing film of all time in the domestic marketplace, and I talked about this a lot last week. Just a great run for that movie around the world, but especially here domestically, where people really latched on. And for people that say that nobody wants to go to the movies, Godzilla Minus One is a great example the other way. It's not a huge blockbuster. It didn't do $300 million, but you can still, and it was the right size movie, if you can find the audience that you're aiming for, you have to go right in the middle of that. You have to kind of wind your way through, and that's what studios are trying to figure out right now. Let's look outside the domestic marketplace at the top 5 films internationally. So these are all markets that are not the United States and Canada. At number 1 is Argylle. It made $17.3 million, followed by Anyone But You at $13.5 million, Wonka at $10.4 million, Poor Things at $8.5 million, and then Migration at $8.455 million. When we take the international grosses, we combine them with the domestic grosses, we get our top 5 films worldwide, and Argylle is number 1 at $34,780,260 off of, again, and we'll talk about this, reportedly a $200 million investment from Apple, not necessarily the budget of the film, but the investment overall. Anyone But You dropped just 9.7% from last week at $16.9 million, followed by Wonka at $15 million, actually a 12.6% increase from last weekend. Migration, also an increase from last weekend, a 17.9% increase and a $12.6 million weekend total. And The Beekeeper drops 34.7% to be number 5 worldwide at $11.48 million. Speaking of Wonka and its worldwide grosses, a couple weeks ago I mentioned that Wonka had become one of the 10 highest grossing films domestically released in 2023. Well, this past week, it also became one of the 10 highest grossing films worldwide released in 2023. It is now the 9th highest grossing 2023 film at the worldwide box office at $572.4 million. It bumps The Little Mermaid down to number 10 and drops Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 off the chart entirely. If you had Wonka outgrossing both of those movies, congratulations, because I sure didn't. Before we move on, I want to talk a little bit about Apple and their investment in Argylle and their investment in original films in general. This is the 3rd film in the last handful of months that's had a reported $200 million investment from Apple that hasn't necessarily panned out for them at the global box office. Of course, Argylle is the latest one. Killers of the Flower Moon panned out as far as some Academy Award nominations. Napoleon got a few others, though probably not the ones that Apple was hoping for. And then Argylle looks to be just an all-around critical and financial and audience failure. And I asked the question here, how much is too much for Apple? Meaning, at what point are they going to look at dramatically scaling back their investment in original films? We had Killers of the Flower Moon, a reported cost of $200 million. Keeping in mind they have distribution partners in all of these film ventures that also would get a cut of what comes in at the box office. So in this case, the distribution partner for Killers of the Flower Moon was Paramount. It's made $156.5 million globally to date, so even if every dollar went back to Apple, it still wouldn't cover the cost of the movie. Napoleon also reportedly had a cost of $200 million. The distribution partner was Sony, a global box office of $218.2 million to date, and then Argylle, a reported cost of $200 million, a distribution partner domestically in Universal, and a $34.7 million global box office today. Honestly, I think it'll be lucky to hit 100 million. It might creep over 100 million worldwide. But if Apple was looking for returns on its investment at the box office, then it's not getting it, because not only is it not making enough money to generate profits in the theatrical window, which is something we cover on the show all the time, but so much of that money would have to go back to their partners that are distributing the film, because Apple doesn't have a film distribution arm. So it's going back to Sony, it's going back to Paramount, it's going back to Universal, or Apple is paying them already those distribution fees out of what they would already take. It doesn't really matter. The point is that what little money might be coming in is going out from Apple to distribute these movies in theaters. And so this brings to mind for me 2 questions. Number 1, how long will Apple continue to invest this heavily in original films? And number 2, how long will Apple continue to invest this heavily in theatrical releases for their original films? I think they find themselves in kind of a bind, because on one hand, it would be a lot cheaper to just cut out theatrical and throw stuff on streaming. But on the other hand, one of the ways they've been able to differentiate themselves in the streaming space is as a place for big name directors like Martin Scorsese or Ridley Scott to go and say, hey, I have a movie and I want to get a theatrical release. And Apple being one of the few that will actually say, yes, we will give that movie a theatrical release. So if they say, well, we're not going to do that anymore, well, then I think they lose that draw drawing power for some of these filmmakers to say, well, okay, but I want one of those things. So if you're not doing it, then I'm going to ignore you, just like I ignore Netflix and anybody else who doesn't want to go theatrical. At the same time, and I've been told so many times, well, it doesn't really matter how much Apple loses because, they've got trillions of dollars. They can take the loss. This is all to drum up publicity for Apple TV Plus and to draw in subscribers. And listen, I understand that point of view. I found that people tell that to me as if it is fact, but I would counter with the fact that yes, Apple has a lot of money, a lot of money. I get that. But I have yet to find a company in my travels, big or small, that will continue to just throw money out the window perpetually. They'll do it at first to see if something works. But then if that thing doesn't work, I can tell you from experience, those purse strings will close and that checkbook will close and that empty check, that blank check that you once got is no longer a blank check. And I honestly think that that's where we're coming from with Apple and their investment in original films. Because keep in mind, it's not just these theatrical films. They've been investing heavily in films for streaming. However, when we look at the Nielsen results and the movies that we see popping up on those ratings charts, I think the only Apple original film that's ever popped up to my knowledge or to my memory on the Nielsen charts is Ghosted. And it did not have strong ratings at all. It was only on the charts for a couple weeks. I think the total viewership numbers that I saw were below that Genie movie that Melissa McCarthy did on Peacock. So we're not seeing a huge presence for Apple original films on streaming, which makes me wonder how big of a draw are these movies for people to sign up to Apple TV Plus. They've also been investing, of course, heavily into original programming that isn't film related on Apple TV Plus. Ted Lasso has really been their only breakout hit. They've had critical hits and cult hits like Severance, but as far as ratings, eyeballs, what people are watching, Ted Lasso was a huge success, but that's pretty much been the only thing that they can hang their hat on. And I say that because I think that that is also going to contribute to the future of investment in film for Apple, because they are going to have to scale back at some point if they're not seeing the results. Now, Apple does not share subscriber numbers because they don't have to, because as people point out to me, they're Apple. But the anecdotal data that different firms have been able to gather have said pretty much across the board that they are trailing basically every other major streaming service as far as signed up paid users. There's a lot of people that are using it on a trial basis, but as far as people paying, that number is pretty low. And yes, Apple could continue to fund it at a huge, heavy loss for a very long time, but I don't think that they will, because that's not how companies like this work. It's not one big pool of money where everybody just walks. It's not like Scrooge McDuck and you just come in and grab some coins. Every division has a budget. Every division has oversight. Every division has executives. We're going to get to a point where Apple says, okay, we need to readjust our strategy. We've seen nearly every other streaming service scale back on their spending. I think we're getting to that point with Apple. I understand the point that they're not like other companies. They're not just content-based. They have a lot of money. They have a lot of free cash flow and whatever else. I get it. But at the same time, I think that Argylle and its performance this weekend is a great example that whatever strategy Apple has isn't working right now. And I think that those purse strings are going to start closing very quickly as they decide what the future of their investment in film and their strategy as far as theatrical release is going to be. So that's a look at what's been moving in the top 10. Before we move on, I want to take a few calls from you at the Mint Mobile hotline. Of course, thanks to Mint Mobile, this has been a great addition for the show where people can call and ask their box office questions. And our first question is from Kevin, who wants to know about how the box office numbers are reported from different sources.
Hey, Dan, this is Kevin from Corvallis, Oregon. I noticed when you are reporting the final domestic grosses for the domestic box office that they're often very specific numbers, but when you're reporting the international grosses, it's often a rounded number. What is the discrepancy in the specific reporting of domestic box office versus the sort of rounded totals for international? Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin, for that question. And it's a great one. The reason why the international numbers are so much rounder, if you will, than the domestic numbers are that the domestic numbers are compiled by data people here in the United States They're the theaters here in the United States that are sending in the actual ticket sales, etc. And they can tabulate those things very quickly. I do this show on Tuesday because the actual numbers are ready by Monday. But the reason that the international numbers are so much rounder is because they are basically estimates, because it's very difficult to get an actual ticket sold count from all of these different countries around the world. So it's very much just taking the basic numbers that we know over the weekend and throwing them into a big pot. That's why we don't know the exact numbers, especially here on the show, because there's so much data to compile and because it's not coming from firms that are based right here in the US that have all of that information right at their fingertips. Our last question is from Jeffrey, who wants a little bit of specification as far as movie theaters and their different formats.
Hey, Dan, this is Jeffrey calling from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, up in Canada. My question has to do with just the different formats that you can see films, especially when it comes to the theaters. As I saw that Dune Part 2 will be having a 70 millimeter presentation in my city. So I was kind of hoping that you could just break down what makes a 70 millimeter presentation, for example, different than just going to a regular old theater and like IMAX and AVX and all of those other things. I'm a little ignorant on the terminology and what it means and if I should be spending more money and all that sort of stuff. So thanks for everything that you do. You're making me actually go to the theaters more often than I would have. So just keep doing you, Dan. Thanks.
Thanks for that question, Jeffrey. And I talk about this stuff on the show with the assumption that everybody is completely knowledgeable about the difference in premium formats versus non-premium formats and IMAX, etc. But the fact is that not everybody is. So I think it's a really instructive thing to break down, especially as we're approaching the release of a big movie like Dune Part 2 that will be available in multiple different formats. So briefly, to break down the different kinds of theater formats and how they differ from one another. First of all, you have just your standard movie theater. Movie theater seats, movie theater sound, movie theater screen. There's no upcharge. It's not a premium format. And it's what I'd say most people probably see the majority of their films on. Then we move on to the non-IMAX premium format cinemas, HDX, Prime at AMC, etc., the Dolby theaters. These are theaters that are equipped with better sound and better digital projection than other theaters. Sometimes the seats are bigger or more comfortable. Sometimes the theaters are a little bit bigger. But the key is that there's an upgrade in video and sound presentation because that's why they can charge you more for it. The equipment is more specialized, the projectors are more specialized, better sound, better picture. And so they're going to be a little bit more expensive, but they're not going to come with the IMAX label or the IMAX brand. Then we get to IMAX. IMAX is both a brand, a type of screen, and a type of film. So let's break that down a little bit. First, we have IMAX theaters, which do have bigger screens, but not all of them are at the native IMAX size. IMAX has a specific size. Some of their screens are able to accommodate that, but some are not. They're called LIMAX screens, not by IMAX, by a lot of other people. They have the IMAX branding, but they're just bigger than usual movie screens, closer to your HDX type formats. Any movie can be shown on an IMAX screen, on a nice big screen, but unless it's specifically noted as filmed for or shot in IMAX, it's not taking advantage of that big IMAX picture, that specific IMAX ratio. It's basically another form of that premium theater format. So if you're wondering if you should pay that theater upgrade for a movie that wasn't specifically filmed for or shot in IMAX, you're not really losing anything by seeing it at a different type of theater other than maybe seeing it on a smaller screen. Then we have movies that are specifically noted as filmed for IMAX. You will see that noted in the marketing materials. This means that a movie was shot specifically to be shown in IMAX theaters, but was not shot with IMAX film cameras. So for example, Avatar: The Way of Water, Top Gun: Maverick was filmed for IMAX, and Dune Part 2 was also filmed for IMAX. This means that the movies were shot digitally. They were not shot on IMAX film, but IMAX was part of the process. A lot of times the movies will take advantage of that IMAX format where it fills the big screen that you're watching, but it was not shot in IMAX. Still, it's optimizing that IMAX setting, the picture, the sound, and it's much closer to the native IMAX experience than a movie, certainly, that was not filmed for IMAX. Then we have movies that were shot in IMAX, which means that the movie was partially shot with an IMAX 65mm film camera. These cameras are cumbersome, they are rare, they are expensive, and it's why not many directors actually shoot in IMAX. Christopher Nolan is one of the only ones that regularly does it. And those are the ones that if you want to see it how it was definitely meant to be seen, that's what you want to see in an IMAX theater because they are shot on IMAX film for IMAX theaters. Now, when it comes to your question about projection, that's a different thing altogether because a movie that is shot in IMAX can be projected digitally, as most IMAX films and most films are right now, or a movie that was shot in IMAX can be projected on 70mm film. It is a huge size of film. It's those big reels that you saw, if you saw with Oppenheimer, those massive film reels, which means that the movie is projected through an old-timey projector. There is a film print that is struck. It is run through a projector. There are very few theaters that are set up to project 70mm IMAX film or 70mm film of any type, which is why when you see these movies that are shown in 70mm, like Oppenheimer, it's often so difficult to get tickets to those movies. The availability is very limited. I was lucky enough to see Oppenheimer on 70mm when I was in Los Angeles last year, and I thought that it looked fantastic because there is a difference between digital projection and projection on film. I thought that the film had a much richer, more natural looking, organic quality, if you will, versus a digital projection. Digital projection is beautiful, it's very clean, but there's a certain something with film that you just don't get with digital. And it's why Christopher Nolan loves film so much. And Quentin Tarantino loves film so much. They like to shoot their movies on film. They like to show their movies on film because it just has a certain quality that is pretty much impossible to replicate. So Jeffrey, in answer to your question about Dune Part 2 and trying to figure out what you want to see, there are some select 70mm showings of Dune Part 2. Now, Dune Part 2 was not shot on IMAX cameras. So none of the movie was shot on film. The 70mm film print that you're going to see that's going to be struck is going to be struck from a digital master. So you're basically seeing an analog version of a digital master. But if you want to see the film unlike really any other way that you could ever possibly see it, I think that it would be worth paying the extra or maybe going through the extra trouble to see Dune Part 2 in 70mm because it was filmed for IMAX. It was filmed to take advantage of the IMAX aspect ratio to take up that full-sized IMAX screen, as long as your local IMAX is an actual IMAX and is able to show it at the proper size and at the proper ratio. But for me, the optimal way to see Dune Part 2 is definitely on a big IMAX screen, the biggest you can get, with great sound. It was shot for that format, and if you can get it on 70mm, I think that's a bonus. I know it's a lot to process, but I hope that was useful for you and anybody else that might wonder just what the difference is between all of these different formats. Thanks to Jeffrey and everybody who asked their questions, and if you'd like your questions answered, you can call the Mint Mobile hotline at +1 323 863 3311. And of course, I want to thank the people that make the Mint Mobile hotline possible, Mint Mobile. It's getting close to Valentine's Day, which is when we celebrate the ones we love. But whether you're single, happily paired, or in a throuple plus, no judgment here, there's one thing we all love, and that's saving money. Well, like a creepy naked Cupid, Mint Mobile is spreading the love because right now, all wireless plans are just $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan. That's unlimited talk, text, and data for $15 a month. How's that for a Valentine? If you choose Mint Mobile, you're making the decision to put money back in your pocket every month. Whatever you're paying for wireless service now, think about what you'd save if that bill was just $15 a month. At Mint, all plans come with unlimited talk and text, plus high-speed data delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. And you don't have to change your number. You can use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and bring your phone number along with all your existing contacts. So dump that overpriced contract today and say yes to Mint Mobile. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/Murrell. That's mintmobile.com/Murrell. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/Murrell. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. All right, let's round out the weekend by looking at our top 5 per theater averages. And at number 1 is the rather provocatively titled How to Have Sex with a $12,149 per theater average, playing in 4 theaters. This film debuted last May at the Cannes Film Festival, where it won the Un Certain Regard Prize, which is basically for new and innovative storytelling. Also screened at the Sundance Film Festival last week and now available in a handful of theaters nationwide. At number 2, playing in just 1 theater, was the German film Skin Deep, which generated a $5,268 gross from that 1 theater. It is a body-switching drama, which sounds kind of interesting. In 3rd place was Argylle, which generated $4,847 per theater in 3,605 theaters. In 4th place was Totem from Mexico, which generated $3,338 per theater in 5 theaters. And at number 5 was the animated film Ensemble, which we've seen pop on and off this chart a few times, generating $3,803 in 9 theaters. Looking at the top 5 films in limited release, so this is 1,000 theaters or fewer, at number 1 was Fighter. I do not have the theater count for this, but I have a number of $1.2 million generated in its second weekend. In 2nd place was The Zone of Interest, which has broken the $1 million barrier in 594 theaters as it continues to expand its release. Origin, playing in 631 theaters, brings in $682,000. Warning 2 in an unknown number of theaters comes in 4th place at $517,830. Sometimes one warning is just not enough. You have to have a second warning. And then in 5th place is The Jungle Bunch Operation Meltdown in an unknown number of theaters. This is a French animated film that was released in France last summer, which brought in $442,441. Looking at the top 10 limited release grossers this year, so this is all tickets sold since January 1st. American Fiction and Poor Things remain at numbers 1 and 2. Their grosses were frozen after they entered wide release. Fighter moves up to number 3 at $6.4 million, which moves Hanuman down to number 4. The Zone of Interest moves up to number 5. Origin moves up to number 6. All of Us Strangers moves down to number 7. Gunter Karam moves down to number 8. And then we have Queen Rock Montreal at number 9 and Freud's Last Session at number 10. Looking at the annual box office numbers, first of all, we have to go back to the 2023 fall holiday box office where we saw a little bit of movement. Migration moves up to number 6, which moves Trolls Band Together down to number 7. Anyone But You is also gaining on the Marvels down there at that number 10 spot. Wonka remains number 1, of course, with a gross of just over $200 million. Looking at the 2024 annual domestic box office, Mean Girls remains number 1 at $66.2 million, followed by The Beekeeper at just under $50 million. Night Swim is in 3rd place at $28.7 million, followed by Argylle debuting in 4th place, The Chosen Season 4 episodes 1 through 3 debuting in 5th, Fighter moving up 1 spot to number 6. Then we have ISS at number 7, The Book of Clarence at number 8, Hanuman at number 9, and Gunter Karam at number 10. Looking at this year's box office as far as total tickets sold since January 1st, regardless of when the movie was released, I thought that Mean Girls was going to overtake Wonka, but it had a big drop, Mean Girls did, this past weekend, and so Wonka remains the top-selling movie this year at $67.9 million, followed by Mean Girls at number 2, Migration at number 3, Anyone But You at number 4, and The Beekeeper at number 5. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom is at number 6, followed by Night Swim at number 7, The Boys in the Boat at number 8, The Iron Claw at number 9, and Poor Things entering the chart at number 10, just edging out Argylle. The Color Purple is now out of the top 10, and should Wonka remain number 1 and not be overtaken by Mean Girls, then come a few weeks from now, Timothée Chalamet may very well have the 2 highest grossing films of the calendar year with Dune Part 2 and Wonka. Looking at the 2024 worldwide box office, at least as best I can do, this information is all over the place. The Beekeeper is the highest grossing film of 2024 worldwide at $122.5 million. Mean Girl is looking to hopefully break that $100 million barrier very soon. It's at $92.5 million. Then we have Night Swim in 3rd place at $43.3 million. Son of a Rich 2 in 4th place at just over $40 million. Fighter breaking the top 5 at $36.3 million. Then Argylle in 6th place at $34.7 million. The Bremen Town Musicians in 7th place. Rock and Roll in 8th place. Alienoid Return to the Future from South Korea in 9th place. And Poland's Klex Academy in 10th place. Before we go, as we almost always do, I skipped last week, but we're back this week. I want to take a look at a weekend in box office history, and we're going to go back 30 years to the beginning of one of the best runs that any actor, I think, has ever had at the box office. This is February 4th through the 6th, 1994, which saw the debut of Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, which catapulted Jim Carrey onto the scene. Sure, if you watched In Living Color, you probably knew who he was, but by the end of 1994, he was the biggest star in Hollywood. Some might say the biggest star in the world. A $12.1 million domestic debut for Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, and a $72.2 million final domestic total. Mrs. Doubtfire, in its 11th week of release, was still in number 2 at $6.9 million. It had grossed $181.5 million thus far, on its way to a $219 million total. In week 7, as Tom Hanks headed towards the Best Actor win for Philadelphia, the film was in 3rd place at $5.8 million, a $44.8 million running total, and a $77.4 million final total. That's right. Ace Ventura: Pet Detective and Philadelphia almost had the same box office final gross. In 4th place, speaking of gross, is a movie called My Father the Hero, starring Gerard Depardieu, which debuted to $5.64 million and ended with $25 million domestically. There's a lot about this movie that should probably best be forgotten. I'll give you the main premise. Katherine Heigl plays a teenager who goes on a cruise with her father, and to impress a boy on the boat, she decides to pretend that her father is her lover. And then it goes from there. Anyway, in 5th place was the James L. Brooks film I'll Do Anything, starring Nick Nolte. It debuted to $4.7 million, on its way to a disappointing $10.4 million domestic total. Of course, we don't like to leave those numbers back in history. We like to adjust for inflation to see what they would look like in today's box office dollars. And when we adjust those numbers, we see that Ace Ventura: Pet Detective debuted to an adjusted total of $24.9 million, on the way to a nearly $150 million domestic total. Mrs. Doubtfire at $14.2 million, on the way to a final total approaching $450 million adjusted for inflation. Philadelphia with an adjusted total of $11.9 million, on the way to a domestic total adjusted at $160 million. And then we have My Father the Hero at an $11.6 million debut with a $52.3 million adjusted domestic total. And then finally, I'll Do Anything at $9.6 million, on the way to a $21.4 million adjusted domestic total. And that does it for Charts with Dan this week. Coming up, a pretty slow weekend at the box office. January and February have just been deadly. This has been a difficult show to do. Lisa Frankenstein is the only major new wide release coming out this upcoming weekend. Disney will also be putting Turning Red out in theaters for the first time. If it does anything like Soul, then it will do almost no business at all. Let's see if it does better than Soul. As always, you can stay tuned right here, not only for box office, but for movie news and reviews and more. Next week should have a lot more stuff to talk about than this week does, or the past several weeks have, and I look forward to doing that here on the channel. I want to thank Mint Mobile for making the Mint Mobile hotline possible, and of course everybody that called and left their questions, but I want to thank you most of all for spending part of your day here with me. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.